Exploring World History by Ray Notgrass with Charlene Notgrass and John Notgrass. Lesson 23, Moses. Moses led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. Through 40 years of wandering in the wilderness and to the brink of the land God had promised to give them, while in the wilderness, Moses was the messenger who gave God's law to Israel. He was the leader who guided them through many trials of faith. Moses was a great leader, but he did not start out being bold and courageous. He grew into the position God gave him, and along the way he showed that he had his share of human failings. Overview of Moses' life. Moses was born in Egypt to Amram and Jochebed from the tribe of Levi. He was raised as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. We assume that he was brought up in the royal household and received an education in keeping with his status. However, he was aware of his Hebrew background, a fact which influenced a divisive moment in his life. When Moses was about 40 years old, he defended a fellow Hebrew by killing the Egyptian who was beating him. Word about his deed got out, and when Pharaoh tried to kill him, Moses escaped to the land of Midian on the Arabian Peninsula. There Moses met the family of Reuel, priest of Midian. Moses married Zipporah, one of the priest's daughters, and the couple had 2 sons. Moses' father-in-law is called by 2 names in the Bible, Reuel, meaning friend of God, and was probably his name, Exodus 2:18, and Jethro, which means excellence, which was probably his title, Exodus 3:1. For the next 40 years, Moses lived as a shepherd for Reuel, no doubt learning wilderness life and also learning the work of the shepherd, skills he would need when leading the people of Israel. Moses spent the first 40 years of life in the household of Pharaoh, and the next 40 years as a shepherd. Quite a come down in status. At the age of 80, Moses received God's call from the burning bush on Mount Horeb, also called Mount Sinai, to return to Egypt and lead his people out of bondage. Moses was reluctant to follow God's instructions, but he obeyed the call and he went back to the land he had left as a wanted man. Pharaoh did not want to let the Israelites leave, but a series of plagues from God finally convinced Pharaoh to do so. Moses led the Israelites through the Red Sea and to Mount Sinai, where God initiated and established the covenant between himself and the nation of Israel. The Lord told Moses to send 12 spies into Canaan who would bring back reports on the land and its inhabitants. 10 of the spies returned with a fearful report and dire warnings about Israel's inability to take the land. Joshua and Caleb were convinced that God would make it happen, but the people believed the 10 negative spies and they bewailed their fate. God punished them by making the people of Israel spend the next 40 years in the wilderness until all adult generation died out, except for Joshua and Caleb. So for the last 40 years of Moses' life, he shepherded Israel in the wilderness, and he brought the new generation to the Jordan River in preparation for entering the Promised Land. Moses himself, however, was not allowed to enter. Earlier, Moses had struck a rock instead of speaking to it to bring forth water. Because of this act of disobedience, God forbid him from going into Canaan. After viewing the land from Mount Pisgah, Moses died at the age of 120. God buried him in the land of Moab. Guided by the hand of God, the life of Moses was clearly guided by the hand of God. He was born under a death threat, as Pharaoh had ordered all male Hebrew children to be cast into the Nile River. Moses' mother did cast her baby into the Nile, but she put him in a basket first. And the daughter of Pharaoh found him. Moses' sister arranged for their own mother to nurse him until he was weaned. 40 years later, Moses fled from Egypt again under a death threat. In Midian, God led him to the family of a priest. When Moses returned to Egypt to free the Israelites, God gave him courage and words to speak when he appealed to Pharaoh. God clearly had purpose for Moses' life, and he saw to it that his will for Moses was fulfilled. A reluctant leader. Moses did not accept the mantle of leadership willingly. When God called him to the scene in the burning bush, Moses gave a series of excuses to try to get out of his assignment, as recorded in Exodus chapters 3 and 4. Number 1. Who am I to do this? Moses asked. God's reply was that he would be with Moses in Exodus 3:11 through 12. It was not so much a question of who Moses was, but who God was, and God was going to be with him. Number 2, what shall I tell the Israelites about who sent me? God was not commonly known by the Israelites, and of course, they had heard much about Egyptian gods. With what divine authority would Moses go? God said that his identity is I am. The God who truly exists, all opposed to the false gods, was his authority. Exodus 3:13 through 15. Number 3, what if they didn't listen to me? What if they deny that God has appeared to me? Moses was not convinced that they would take his word for it, so God showed him 2 miracles and gave him the promise of a third as proof that God had indeed spoken with him. Exodus 4:1 through 9. Number 4, but I'm not eloquent. I'm slow of speech and tongue. Evidently, Moses had some speech impediment of a great fear of speaking in public. He thought God should use someone else, eloquent in the role. But God replied, who made the mouth? Who makes someone dumb or deaf? In other words, God was in control of Moses' mouth. The Lord would be with his mouth and would give him the words to say. Exodus 4:10 through 12. And number 5, Lord, send whomever you want, Moses said at last, which meant anyone but me. The Lord was angry with Moses and said that Aaron would be Moses' mouthpiece. God indeed sent someone else, but only to accompany Moses in Exodus 4:13 through 16. Sometimes we give excuses to God, but they really do no good. God knows the situation, and he knows us better than we do. Moses was reluctant, but God could still use him as long as he obeyed. Moses' weakness did not stop him from being God's servant. God wanted Moses in this role, and then, though Moses was not all he could have been at the time, God trained him on the job. Intercessor for others. Moses spent his life interceding for others. He acted on behalf of fellow Israelites when the latter was being beaten by an Egyptian. He helped the daughters of Reuel when shepherds drove them from the water. Moses pleaded with God on behalf of Egypt during the plagues. Of course, Moses presented God's case to Pharaoh on behalf of the people of Israel. In the wilderness, Moses appealed to God on behalf of the Israelites when God was ready to destroy them. On 2 occasions, God considered wiping out Israel and starting over with Moses to build a nation. Exodus 32:9 through 10 and Numbers 14:11 through 12. This was something God had done before in the case of Noah. Moses pleaded Israel's case, even though the people were ready to cast him off and select a new leader in Numbers 14:4. On both of these occasions, Moses told God that the action he was planning to take would not look good to other nations. Moses pleaded with God on behalf of Egypt during the plagues. Of course, Moses presented God's case to Pharaoh on behalf of the people of Israel. In the wilderness, Moses appealed to God on behalf of the Israelites when God was ready to destroy them. On 2 occasions, God considered wiping out Israel and starting over with Moses to build a nation. This was something God had done before in the case of Noah. Moses pleaded Israel's case even though the people were ready to cast him off and select a new leader. Numbers 14:4. On both of these occasions, Moses told God that the action he was planning to take would not look good to other nations. It would make it appear that God had brought Israel out of Egypt just to do away with them. Moses said other nations would think that God was not strong enough to bring the people into Canaan. In addition, Moses pointed out God had made a covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He had given his word about giving the land to their descendants. In Numbers 14:17 through 18, Moses quoted God's own words to him with words he had spoken to Moses in Exodus 34:6 and 7, about being compassionate, gracious, and slow to anger. God relented on both occasions, but he did punish Israel appropriately. Close relationship with God. The Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, just as a man speaks to his friend. Exodus 33:11. See also Numbers 12:6 through 8. Moses probably enjoyed a closer intimacy with the Almighty than anyone else who had ever walked this planet except for the Lord Jesus himself. This intimacy changed Moses' life and helped him to become the leader that he was. God initiated the relationship at the burning bush, and neither he nor Moses ever moved away from that closeness. It is because of this intimacy that Moses was able to intercede for the Israelites as mentioned above. After the incident of the golden calf, God declared to Moses that he would not go with Israel into the promised land. Moses again appealed to the Lord, saying that God's presence with them distinguished Israel from all the other nations on the earth. Moses asked to know God's ways so that he could find favor in his sight. God agreed to do this, and Moses asked to see God's glory. God allowed Moses to see his back, for no man could see his face of God and live. And the Lord declared to Moses his goodness and compassion. Moses' face was changed by his conversations with the Lord. When he came down from talking with God on Mount Sinai, his face shone. The people were afraid to come near him, so Moses began to wear a veil. He lifted the veil when he talked with the Lord, but he kept the veil in front of his face at other times. Paul wrote that Moses used the veil so that the people could not see the shine on his face faded over time. 2 Corinthians 3:13. Moses was not only transformed physically by his relationship to God, but inwardly as well. Moses' spiritual growth. At first, as mentioned earlier, Moses was reluctant to do God's bidding. He feared that since the Israelites would not listen to him, neither would Pharaoh. However, Moses eventually went boldly to Pharaoh, and, as we have noted, he approached God himself with great confidence. As the Egyptian army was approaching the Israelites at the Red Sea, Moses assured the frightened people that God would act on their behalf. God said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the sons of Israel to go forward." Exodus 14:15. In other words, there is an appropriate time for prayer, but then comes the time for action. It is maturity to know when those times are. Moses struggled deeply with the Israelites' lack of faith. At times he rebuked them, at times he complained about them to the Lord, and at other times he interceded to God on their behalf. It takes a person of great maturity to be able to separate the sin from the sinner, to rebuke sin when necessary, but to pray for someone out of a heart of concern when prayer is needed. Moses learned the art of delegation from his father-in-law. Jethro noticed that Moses was spending all day, every day, deciding between the people. Knowing how they grumbled against God, we can only imagine how they complained about each other. Jethro told Moses that he was in danger of letting the people wear him out with this responsibility. Moses needed to appoint able men who feared God, men of truth, those who hate dishonest gain, to serve as arbiters among small groups of Israelites. Moses himself needed to concentrate on being the people's representative before God and handling the major disputes. Moses followed Jethro's advice, and life among the people ran much more smoothly. This incident is an example of the wise delegation of responsibility and the value of recognizing godly men who can serve God's people. Exodus 18:13-26. In spite of his growth and his years of faithful service, Moses was not perfect. At Meribah, the Israelites again grumbled about Moses, this time because they did not have water. God told Moses to speak to the rock, and water would come forth. But in his anger, however, Moses struck the rock. Because of his disobedience, God did not allow Moses to enter the Promised Land. God said that Moses did not believe God or treat him as holy in the sight of the people. God could not let such obvious disobedience go unpunished. The consequences of doing so would have been too great for the people of Israel. Choose life. The book of Deuteronomy is a series of 3 sermons that Moses gave near the end of his life to the people of Israel as they were preparing to enter Canaan. He reviewed what had happened to them from the Exodus to that point, reiterated some of the law that God had given through him, and made a final exhortation to the people to serve God faithfully, even though he knew they would not. When Moses had outlined the choice they faced of following or rejecting God, he said, "I call heaven and earth to witness against you today, that I have set before you life and death, and blessing and curse. So choose life in order that you may live, you and your descendants." Deuteronomy 30:19. Moses laid down his life to serve his people, even though they did not appreciate him, and often complained about what he did. He showed that he was able to rise above such pettiness, and in so doing he set an example that many generations after him would appreciate and honor. God showed his wisdom in choosing Moses to be the leader of Israel at the most critical time in their history. The world is different because of what he did. A note on terms. Through the centuries, people have used several terms for the land area of the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. In this curriculum, we use the term Israel to refer to the nation of Israel, both ancient and modern. We use the historical term Palestine to refer to the larger area that includes Israel, especially during the period from the Roman occupation of ancient Israel to the establishment of the modern state of Israel. Now Moses was faithful in all his house as a servant, for a testimony of those things which were to be spoken later, Hebrews 3:5.